So hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Now this is my next technical video on carbon fibre bicycle construction. Is it really as good as we think it is? Is it the best material? Is it the easiest material to make something stiff and light from? Let's look at the truth, because actually it's a really complex thing to get right, and I'm not sure many people out there know how difficult it is to get it right, because there's a lot of noise out there in cycling media that just thinks it's the best thing since sliced bread. So let's have a look at the PowerPoint. Let's hope it's not too technical and too long. I'll try and keep it as brief as I can. Then look at the contents. We're going to cleanse you from the marketing brainwash and bullshit out there about carbon fibre. That involves some of the culprits in cycling that just preach on about it. And let's actually educate ourselves to form a better understanding of how complex it is, how the properties work, and learn more about the material and how to actually make a carbon part. So you might recognise this guy on the right if you're into cars. Like, I'm a car guy as well, and this is the kind of guy that sees a carbon fibre part and wets himself. It's like, it just makes him jizz everywhere. And I actually don't see the fascination myself in but it's all over the automotive industry as like this. It's like the ultimate in bling. Anyway, carbon fibre was developed as a structural material, predominantly in aerospace, like years and years ago. 50s, 60s, we started to think about carbon fibre as a material, and it's just now used in anything from like jewellery, car interiors, where it has no structural purpose at all, and it's just decorative trinkets of shite that people like this go absolutely mad for. And it sells sports cars. You look at any new sports cars, BMWs, anything, the more carbon fibre crap they can stick on the outside, the more people seem to like it. And yeah, it's a good material, but it's amazing the power it has. So what my point is, if someone makes something out of carbon fibre, it's like this extra power that it has that people think it's amazing, and it isn't. It's everywhere. People think it's exotic. To me, I think that's a fallacy. It's not. The demographic of this carbon fibre marketing tends to be the same as the demographic of cycling, like 18 to 45-year-old blokes. Seem to be amazed by it, and so yeah, the carbon marketing wheel just keeps on churning, and it's not as amazing as it's made out to be. I mean, it's good, but it's just gone mad, basically. In cycling, it's mostly, everything you read about carbon is just noise. There's no actual factual evidence and no data presented when kind of these guys on the screen are testing bikes. Now, I've got the guy from GCN down the bottom there, John. I actually quite like him because he's so enthusiastic about cycling. But I'm sorry, but these kind of news outlets, I don't know if actually any know anything about carbon fibre. But anyway, skipping on. So let's quickly look at carbon fibre compared to aluminium. Is it really that different when you make a bike frame of it? And is it worth the price increase? Now, this second part on the screen here, let me turn my pointer on. This is something I read on a popular cycling forum called Weight Weenies. It's 2 times as stiff as an aluminium frame and 40% as light. Well, I can tell you that's bullshit, and we'll come to that. But that's common. Like you read that in the cycling reviews about carbon fibre, but that's a common misconception, and it's absolutely rubbish. So let's actually educate ourselves on carbon first before we make these assumptions. Carrying on the comparison with the most popular other bike material is aluminium these days. Let's take 7075 T6 and Toray T700, which seems to be the go-to fibre for most frame makers. Now, great, we know that carbon fibre is a lot lighter. We can see here, if we look at the density, it's massively lighter than aluminium. And if we just look at this data sheet from Toray, we can see the tensile modulus, which is basically, in layman's terms, the stiffness of the part, is over 3 times as stiff as the aluminium, right? So we've got 230 for T700 and 70 gigapascals for aluminium. Right, moving on. Wrong. You can't just make something out of pure fibres. This data from Toray, which is widely quoted by the bike industry, is misleading. You can't just make something out of raw fibres and no matrix material. Like, you can't just not add epoxy. So you'll never get this 230. This is where the bad news starts to occur. Like I said, you can't just use the fibres. You need an epoxy to hold those fibres together into a ply. Now, a pre-preg, which is a ply of a sheet of carbon fibre pre-impregnated with a matrix, like a polymer could be a polyester or an epoxy, typically has around 43% by volume epoxy and 57% fibres, the stiff carbon fibres longitudinally. Now, you rarely go outside of those bounds of kind of 60-40 because it's just physically impossible. You can't have this ply, let's say applies, you know, this is a cut through a ply and you've got some carbon strands here. You can't have these gaps empty. You need to fill it with something. You need to fill it with epoxy. Now, it's just the same as like if you're stacking beer cans in a box, you can't, if the beer cans are round, you'll have these gaps between them, and it's the same with carbon. Carbon fibres are round, you need to fill those gaps with something, and by law of area, it's around 40 to 50%, and it has to be epoxy. Now the epoxy is very good at transferring the shear strains between one fibre to the one next to it, but it doesn't have a lot of stiffness on its own. So typically it might have around 2 to 5 gigapascals of tensile modulus, whereas the carbon fibre strand itself has around 230. So it really doesn't add anything to the ply. It's just holding the things together so they can be cured into a shape. It doesn't really contribute much. So what happens now? So that massive fibre stiffness in tensile stiffness of 230 gigapascals, which is often quoted, gets diluted massively. And if we consider that the epoxy has basically negligible stiffness compared to that, we can say that the stiffness of a single ply is around 57% of the pure tensile stiffness of the fibres without the epoxy. That gives us a stiffness of the ply of 134. So this is a more true figure of a UD ply stiffness, not 230. It's 134. It's based on like the rule of mixtures approach. This is the first step. So you'll never have a part with the stiffness quoted of 230. It's impossible because you need that epoxy. Otherwise, it would just be a loose bundle of hair without any stiffness in any direction. Now, this is, like I said, that's where the bad news starts. It gets worse because you can't make a complexly loaded part out of all UD fibres. If you want stiffness in other directions like torsion or buckling, you need to lay these plies up in different angles to the loading so it's strong in all directions, because carbon fibre, UD carbon fibre, is very stiff in one direction, but if you try to pull it 90 degrees, it's very, very weak, or it doesn't have much stiffness. So you need to make what's called a layup of fibres in all different directions. And as you lay the plies into a laminate with directions that deviate from 0 degrees to the loading, you get stiffness dilution, and we'll see the effect of that when you start making laminates. Meanwhile, aluminium is always 70 gigapascals in all direction. You know, it doesn't matter if you tensile load it that way or you tensile load it that way, 90 degrees, it's still 70. So it's very simple. Now, my point here, if care is not taken, it's really easy to produce a carbon laminate or a carbon part that actually has less stiffness than the same part in aluminium if you load it longitudinally. Oh, that's crazy, because if you think of carbon, you look at anything carbon and think, wow, that's stiffer than aluminium. It's not always the case. Okay, it can still be lighter for the same geometry, massively lighter. But if you fuck the layup up, you can make a carbon tube less stiff and tensile modulus than aluminium. And we'll come to why. So the overall stiffness of the carbon laminate tube depends on the layup. And there are a number of different methods to find the overall stiffness of a complex layup. The most accurate thing to do is a physical test, but this is really inefficient because you actually have to make the layup first before you can test it. So you might end up making 5 tubes with 5 different layups, and then you'll test it with a load and measure the deflection. And yeah, you use a lot of time, a lot of wasted material, and it's just not the most efficient. It's very accurate, but not the most efficient method. The second method is a rule of mixtures approach. That basically takes into account the strength of the fibres in all different directions, and it's kind of an average depending on how many layers you've got in each direction at 0 degrees and 45 and 90. That's kind of the quick method you can do by hand calculation, and it's pretty easy to do. It's actually quite accurate, and that's the one I use most. Or you can do a quite conservative approach, which is called classic laminate analysis, and that uses a very complex matrix, which I'll show you in a minute, but it is quite conservative. So if you're making parts where safety is critical, you'd use this approach. but it's very complex, and you need the help of just a matrix calculator. Basically, you can use Excel, MATLAB, Python, something like that, and I use Excel Calc, but yeah. So we'll now look at how easy it is to mess up the layup of a down tube in a bike. So if you saw this massive boxy down tube, you think, oh, that's going to be stiffer than the equivalent part in aluminium if it's the same thickness, same geometry in it. And we'll see that actually it's not always the case, because it depends so heavily on the layup. Now, the loading of a down tube is extremely complex. You've got bending, which comes from the rider weight. You've got the vertical G forces, so the rider weight times a number of G, let's say when you hit bumps, and then you've got bending of the head tube and down tube when you jam on the front brakes. It tries to bend the front of the down tube, so that would be bending. So that would use the fibres in the 0 degree direction. You then got torque, which comes from the pedaling forces and the cornering. Especially if you're leaning the bike over hard in a corner and there's a vertical input in the fork, that will create a torque on the down tube, and that utilises fibres in 45 degree direction. Then you've got buckling. Now, this is not so important, but you get a bit of buckling, which is basically just a compressional load of the down tube due to braking and also like frontal impacts or crashes. But that's kind of, you wouldn't spend so much attention to buckling, because buckling is a whole different physical problem anyway, and that goes for aluminium as well. Buckling depends on how the thing is supported. So it's, like I said, it's complex. So you need a varied layup in terms of fibre direction to deal with all these complex loading. And I guarantee that most of the bike industry engineers don't actually know, like, okay, 60% of the loading is bending, 40% is torque, like, or is it, you know, 70-30 or 50-50. Like, it's very hard to actually measure these load cases and vary the layup accordingly. So it's kind of a bit of a guess. And if we take a guess, you'll see how easy it is to fuck it up. So let's take an example of a down tube that's 2 mil thick in the wall thickness and around 50 mil diameter. And let's see how difficult it is to get a stiffer part than aluminium with a layup. Okay, go to the Excel. This is where it gets messy. So this is my classic laminate approach calculator Excel, and I've just converted it to let's form a layout for a down tube as an example. So on the left here we've got number of layers. So each layer is a single ply of pre-preg carbon fibre. We've got the thickness of each layer, commonly around 0.125 mil, and if we've got 16 layers we get total wall thickness around 2 mil. Now, I don't actually know what most bike wall thickness is, but that's an approximation. Yeah, it's probably roughly the right size in some tubes of a bike. I don't really know, but anyway, that total wall thickness doesn't affect the stiffness of the tube, which I'm about to show you. Now, on the right here is the matrix calculations you need to go through by hand if you want to do this by hand. Now, I've plugged them into another tab on the Excel, and it would take you forever to do these by hands for complex shapes. So you typically use a program or you know, Python or MATLAB or something to do that for you, or Excel even. And yeah, it's very messy doing this method, but it's very accurate and it's quite conservative as well. So here on the left we've got the longitudinal Young's modulus of the fibres. Now we work those out as 134, and that comes from having around, what do we say, 57% of the ply volume as fibres. So that's our first part of dilution. We've got the transverse modulus of the UD ply. Now what does that mean? Well, that's the stiffness 90 degrees. So if you've got all the fibres running this way, they're very strong. But if you were to pull them apart, you're basically not using the strength of the fibres very much. You're relying on the tensile strength of the modulus, the tensile stiffness of the epoxy, sorry, to give you the stiffness in that direction. That's very low, it's about 8. You can get these from data tables really, or you can find them yourself. Shear modulus, we'll come to that in a minute. Approximated Poisson ratio, that's something you don't really need to worry about, but Poisson ratio means if you stretch something that way, how much does it constrict that way? And that goes to metallic objects, laminates, anything. And then the alpha angle, which is the layup direction. So if you see like the first 7 layers here, they are laid up in 0 degrees to the loading. So that's very high tensile modulus, tensile stiffness that way, which is which is used for the bending of the down tube. So like I said, the rider weight, some of the braking and the bump forces will use these layers for the stiffness. You then got a number of layers in 45 and minus 45, so like that across the length of the down tube, and that gives you the torsional stiffness of the down tube. So the torsional stiffness, which comes from the pedalling and the cornering, and then you've got a couple of 90-90 layers, which can be for impact toughness or visual appearance. You know, sometimes you might have a 90-90 on top just for looking. It like look nice, like a woven weave. And then if you plug all these layers into the stiffness compliance matrix, we can see the equivalent Young's modulus, or the equivalent tensile modulus, let's just say, is 72 gigapascals. Now, that is crazy, because we started at 230 gigapascals for the fibre, then we then got to 134 for a single UD ply, and now we're down at 72 gigapascals for the whole shape. And now let's remind ourselves that aluminium is 70. So we're basically, by doing this layup like this, half the fibres 0 degrees, around half of them in torsion at 45, we've massively reduced the stiffness of what we thought we had, and now we're down at 72, which is basically the same as aluminium. Okay, this tube for the same wall thickness is going to be a lot lighter than the aluminium, but we can see it's actually, it's about the same stiffness. If you took the down tube and you put a weight on the end and you measured the deflection, you're going to get the same deflection as you would if it was aluminium. Now that, if you haven't thought about this laminate approach, that seems mental, but I can assure you that's what happens. You get this stiffness dilution as you lay fibres off the 0 degree axis to loading, and it's just not as stiff as you thought. So how can you deal with this? Well, you can make the wall thickness bigger and still have the carbon frames much lighter. But what I'm trying to say to you is, you don't get this kind of like double free lunch scenario where you get massively lighter and massively stiffer. You kind of have a bit of both, or one or the other. So if you wanted to make it the same weight as the aluminium, it would be massively stiffer. If you wanted to have massively lighter than aluminium, you could have it the same stiffness. Now, or you could go somewhere in between with those, so you get a bit lighter and a bit stiffer. But what I'm trying to say is, it's never as stiff as you think it is. So it's not this wonder material, and that's why you do see bikes out there approaching the same, like aluminium bikes like CAD 12, CAD 13. They're not actually that much heavier than the carbon equivalent. Now in those scenarios I would say, okay, they're definitely not going to be as stiff. But let's say you had an aluminium bike that was 1500 grams and the carbon one was 1000 grams, then you could probably say it's probably around the same stiffness. So you're not losing out massively if you're buying a heavier aluminium bike. You're not probably going to have a less stiff bike than a carbon bike. And I would say at the lower end of the carbon bike price range, there'll be more epoxy, less fibres, so you'll have even more stiffness dilution, and they've probably not got the laminate spot on, so you've probably got a very low stiffness frame anyway if you've gone for a very cheap carbon fibre frame. Now, this layup for the down tube, this was just kind of a guess, like, okay, so I've got half the fibres going 0, half of them going 45 for torque. It's just like half and half bending and torque. You can increase the bending stiffness up to around 100 gigapascal, so you've got like 50% stiffer than aluminium. But then you're not going to, if you replace some of these 45 degree layers with more 0 degree layers, you're going to lose the torsional rigidity of the tube, which is also important. And it's, like I said before, it's very hard to calculate how much torsional rigidity you need, how much bending stiffness you need, because there's not really like one rig you can put a bike frame on, or you'd have to instrument a bike frame, go and ride it on the road for a stage and look at all the loading, and it's so complex and there's so much noise there that it's really hard to actually know what layup you should use, and a lot of it is kind of like trial and error. And in the end, you will just have to end up adding more carbon layers, which does bring the weight up closer to the aluminium frame. That's why we don't see these massive differences in weights between aluminium and carbon, because with the carbon one, it's the layup becomes so complex, you just need to add more to bring the stiffness up. And anyway, that's my whole point about carbon fibre. It's not this wonder material, it's very hard to get right, and I wonder if anyone has actually come up with the optimized layout for a down tube or the whole bike, because it is so difficult. Anyway, I hope you understood that video, and it's a bit of a rant about carbon, and if you liked it, then please do leave a comment, hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the little bell icon as well, because apparently that helps me out a lot. Someone who understands online marketing told me. But yeah, so keep riding the carbon. You know now why there's not so much of a weight difference, and I hope the person who made your carbon bike has got the optimized layout, because it's really, really hard to do. Anyway, cheers, I'll see you again soon.